Friends, have you ever considered how a man of colossal power, one who seemingly could crush entire armies with his bare hands, could ultimately fall at the hands of a woman? Samson, renowned as the strongest man described in the Bible, suffered his most devastating defeat not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, deceptive whispers of Delilah. But what truly happened? What compelled this woman to betray a man who was the pillar of Israel's might? Was it mere greed, an irresistible temptation, or something even darker that we may never fully comprehend? This story is more than just a tale of incredible physical strength. It is a profound reflection on vulnerability, trust, and the tragic consequences of our choices. As we delve deeper into this narrative of betrayal, we will strive to uncover Delilah's true motives and explore why she decided to bring down a man who seemed utterly invincible. Was it a cold, strategic move driven by external pressure and political intrigue? Or was it something deeply personal, a calculated decision that ultimately cost Samson everything? Today, I will tell you the full story of the strongest man in the Bible. Imagine possessing all the power in the world, yet being brought down by a whisper in the dark. How did the hero of Israel, whose name still echoes through the halls of history, fall so tragically? This is not merely a story of love and betrayal filled with dramatic twists. It is a cautionary tale for all of us about the hidden dangers we sometimes overlook, even when we consider ourselves invulnerable. Are you ready to peel back the layers and uncover the truth behind this heartbreaking betrayal? Why did Delilah betray Samson, the strongest man described in the Bible? Samson's story begins long before his birth, in a time of deep suffering and fervent prayers. His parents, Manoah and his wife, whose name unfortunately remains unknown in Scripture, carried the heavy sorrow of barrenness. In those days, childlessness was considered not only a personal tragedy, but also a kind of curse, a sign of divine disfavor. And there was no greater desire for this couple than to have a long-awaited child. Manoah and his wife poured out their hearts in prayer, but their pleas remained unheard until one day something utterly extraordinary happened that changed the course of their lives. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife when she was alone, bringing a message of hope and divine intervention. She, who had long been barren, was told that she would conceive a child despite her inability to bear children. However, this child was no ordinary son, but one chosen from above. He was destined to be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the moment of conception until the day of his death. He was not just a gift to his parents, but a divine promise to the entire nation of Israel. Samson was chosen to be his people's deliverer, a man destined to free the Israelites from the oppression of the Philistines, who at that time controlled much of the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, an extraordinary event unfolded. The angel of the Lord appeared to a barren woman and foretold the birth of a son who would become the deliverer of the people. This news was not merely a joyful prediction, it was a supernatural act that initiated a grand plan designed to change the future of a nation. From the moment of his birth, Samson was marked with the seal of chosenness. His mother was given specific instructions regarding his upbringing. She was to abstain from wine and all unclean things, for her child was to be holy to the Lord. But perhaps the most crucial commandment was that Samson's hair was never to be cut, for in it lay the key to his divine strength. The Nazirite vow, which he embodied, served as a symbol of his separation for God, reflecting his role as a man chosen for a divine purpose. The strands of hair growing on his head represented a sacred connection between Samson and the Lord. As long as he kept this vow, God's power remained with him, endowing him with might that surpassed that of any ordinary man. As he grew, Samson became increasingly aware of the uniqueness of his existence. Unlike his carefree peers, he understood that his life did not entirely belong to him. He was not just a child, He was the living embodiment of God's promise to Israel. His strength was not the result of his own efforts, but a divine gift, power intended for purposes far beyond personal gain. He was chosen not only to possess extraordinary strength, but also to lead and deliver his people. However, such a great calling could not be without trials. Samson soon discovered that, despite his extraordinary gifts, he was not immune to the temptations inherent in human nature. His physical might was unparalleled, but his heart remained susceptible to the same weaknesses and desires as all people. Samson's path was predetermined as a series of triumphs and defeats. Possessing immense strength, he was not immune to mistakes. At times, he succumbed to his desires, losing sight of his divine purpose. Samson's story serves as a reminder that even God's chosen, even the most powerful of men, are not beyond the reach of temptation. It is a narrative of strength, but also of vulnerability. A tale of a man called to lead but struggling with the very nature that makes him human. Could he rise after his falls? Would his relationship with God endure the mistakes he would make along his path? And now we face the question, what lesson should be learned from Samson's life? What happens when a man chosen by God for great deeds confronts his own weaknesses? Will Samson's strength be enough to overcome his flaws, or will his failures lead to his demise? Only time will tell, but one thing is clear: his story is far from over. The first manifestation of Samson's inner turmoil was his decision to marry a Philistine woman, which caused deep distress to his parents, who understood well that such a union went against divine providence. Despite this, Samson remained steadfast in his intention, which only highlighted the ongoing struggle between his sacred calling and personal desires. Despite realizing that the Philistine woman was not part of God's plan for his life, he felt an irresistible attraction to her. His parents' reluctance was evident, but Samson remained unyielding. He claimed that this marriage was part of a grand divine design, a way to initiate conflict with the Philistines. This statement revealed an important facet of his character. Despite a deep devotion to his mission, he often acted impulsively, making decisions under the influence of momentary desires, which ultimately led him to regret. Despite this impulsiveness, Samson's life was marked by heroic feats and triumphant victories. Possessing unprecedented strength, he brought great victories to Israel. However, his uniqueness lay not only in his physical might, but also in the presence of God in his life, which made his strength supernatural. One of his most famous exploits was killing a lion with his bare hands, which would have been impossible for an ordinary man. It was divine power that allowed him to perform seemingly impossible deeds, and this was only the beginning of his legendary exploits. In another memorable battle, Samson faced 1,000 Philistines, armed and ready for combat. They believed their numerical superiority would crush him, but they did not understand that Samson was not fighting alone. His strength was fueled by something far greater than his own might. Surrounded by enemies in an open field, Samson picked up a discarded donkey's jawbone, a most unusual weapon. However, in his hands, this humble bone transformed into an instrument of destruction. The jawbone, seemingly a simple object, became a deadly weapon thanks to the divine power with which Samson was endowed. Wielding it like a club, Samson struck down the Philistines one by one, not merely defeating them but crushing them with a fury that seemed unstoppable. Every blow, it seemed, came not only from his strength, but from a power surpassing physical comprehension, a power driven by divine might. As Samson's victories multiplied, the Philistines began to realize that he was not just a legendary figure, but a real threat to their dominion. At that time, the Philistines yearned for dominance more than ever. They realized it was only a matter of time before they would have to take decisive action to neutralize Samson. Tension mounted among the enemies, and it was at this moment that fate brought Samson to Delilah, transforming his already complicated life into a tragic odyssey. By the time he met Delilah, Samson was already known as an outstanding hero, possessing incredible strength and performing extraordinary feats. He had become a legend, revered by his people for numerous victories. However, despite all his triumphs and divine power, he remained human, susceptible to the weaknesses and temptations common to everyone. It was at this moment of vulnerability and humanity that Delilah entered his life, initiating a chain of events that led to his downfall. Samson's story is a tale of triumph and defeat, of divine power and human weakness. It raises an important question. How could a man endowed with such might and chosen by God fall victim to the temptations inherent in human nature? Was Samson's strength enough to overcome all trials, or was his susceptibility to temptation part of the divine plan? Reflecting on his fate, we wonder what happens when a man with such divine potential faces his most difficult test. Delilah was no ordinary woman, and her attractiveness was not her only asset. Behind her captivating appearance lay a clear and singular purpose. Whether driven by personal ambition or a puppet in others' hands, Delilah was destined for a pivotal role that would change Samson's fate. Living in the valley of Sorek, strategically located between the lands of Israel and the Philistines, Delilah found herself at the very heart of the enemy camp. Her life was closely intertwined with that of the Philistines, and she well understood what was at stake. If she succeeded in overthrowing Samson, Israel's most powerful warrior, she would not only gain immense wealth and material benefits, but also secure power and influence for herself. The Philistine lords were desperate. They understood that the only way to defeat Samson and neutralize his incredible strength was to uncover the secret underlying it. Samson's strength seemed invincible, and despite all attempts, the Philistines could not unravel the source of his divine power. So they turned to Delilah, using a combination of charm, cunning, and calculated intentions. They made her an offer that was hard to refuse. In exchange for a generous sum of silver, Delilah was tasked with discovering the secret of Samson's immense strength. This assignment, which she accepted, came with considerable difficulties. However, Delilah understood that the reward justified the risk. A strategist to the core, she employed all her skills to draw close to Samson. She skillfully wove a web of seduction and manipulation, captivating him with her charm and persuasive words. Delilah exercised extreme caution, patience, and perceptiveness, gradually winning Samson's trust, steadily approaching the unraveling of his innermost secret. Gradually, through caresses and entreaties, Delilah pushed Samson towards revealing the truth, realizing that with each passing moment, her influence over him grew. But what was it about Samson that made him so susceptible to Delilah's advances? Perhaps it was merely human weaknesses, or something deeper. Ultimately, Samson was God's chosen, yet he fell into Delilah's snares despite obvious warnings. Was he blind to her true intentions? Or was he deceiving himself, believing her love was sincere? As she continued her spell over Samson, Delilah felt her power grow. However, she also understood that time was relentlessly ticking away. The Philistines had high hopes for her, and failure threatened terrible consequences. With each attempt to extract Samson's secret, Delilah moved closer to her goal. But would her victory come at too high a price? Would she become so entangled in this mission that she would ultimately destroy both Samson and herself? Blinded by his passion for Delilah, Samson failed to notice the manipulation unfolding before his eyes. Initially, Delilah did not directly question the secret of his strength. She began with subtle hints, asking indirect questions, cautiously probing to understand what made him invincible. Although Samson possessed incredible physical strength, he was not immune to the temptations of the flesh, and Delilah was well aware of this weakness. It was then, when she began to use her feminine charms, her emotions, and her cunning to influence him, that the real game began. She approached him with the tenderness of a devoted lover, gradually gaining his trust and affection while secretly working against him. Delilah's first attempt was cautious, aimed at testing the waters. She asked Samson if there was anything that could deprive him of his strength, anything that could defeat him. Samson, perhaps not fully realizing the danger he was in, joked and lied. "If I am bound with 7 fresh bowstrings," he said, "I will become as weak as any other man." Delilah, a woman distinguished not only by beauty but also by cunning, did not miss such a favorable opportunity. That very night, while the strong man slept soundly, she took 7 brand-new, unmoistened bowstrings, tightly bound Samson with them, and immediately called the Philistine rulers to come and ambush him. But when the warriors tried to set an ambush, Samson's incomprehensible divine strength burst forth, and the bowstrings snapped with the same ease as if they were mere threads. The Philistines scattered in terror, and Samson, still unaware of the full depth of Delilah's betrayal, shrugged off the incident, deciding she had merely made a foolish mistake. However, Delilah's persistence was truly relentless. She was not going to give up so easily after the first setback. On the contrary, it only strengthened her resolve. She understood perfectly that the real battle was not on the level of physical strength, but in the realm of emotions and feelings. Samson, being a passionate and easily swayed man, became increasingly vulnerable to her charms. Delilah knew the impression her beauty and feminine allure made on him, but it was the psychological pressure she began to exert on him that slowly but surely eroded his will. With each passing night, Delilah's questions grew more insistent and demanding, and with each new moment, she tightened her grip on Samson's heart. Soon, Samson, a man who had never revealed the secret of his incredible strength to anyone, began to let down his guard. Delilah's emotional manipulation gradually wore him down. What he once perceived as true love now proved to be firmly intertwined with deceit and cunning manipulation. Samson began to believe that his trust in Delilah could overcome any danger, and with each night he came closer and closer to revealing the secret he had vowed to keep at all costs. And finally, exhausted by her relentless questioning and worn down by his own vulnerability, Samson surrendered. "My strength comes from God," he confessed. "If my hair is cut, my strength will immediately disappear, and I will become as powerless as any other warrior man." These words, so simple yet so crucial, became the point of no return. Delilah, though feigning surprise and concern, was already planning for the future. As soon as Samson fell into a deep sleep, she called a man to cut his hair, thereby severing the symbol of his covenant with God. At that very moment, what once seemed utterly impossible, namely the loss of Samson's strength, became a cruel reality. With the disappearance of his hair, Samson's divine strength vanished, and the hero who once tore lions barehanded and single-handedly defeated entire armies was transformed into a mere mortal. When Samson awoke, he initially felt nothing unusual. He always woke with an unshakable sense of his own invincibility. But today, everything was completely different. He felt that something was wrong, though he couldn't grasp what it was. When he saw the Philistines approaching, he instinctively tried to stand and fight as he always did. But to his horror, his body did not respond properly. The strength that allowed him to destroy entire cities and single-handedly confront thousands of enemies had vanished without a trace. He tried to get to his feet, to break free from his bonds, but he was weak and utterly powerless. But it was already too late to change anything. The Philistines, realizing Samson's vulnerability, wasted no time. They easily captured him, and without even bothering with chains, escorted him to Gaza, one of the main cities of Philistia. Samson, once a symbol of strength and divinely bestowed power, became a pathetic sight, an object of ridicule for his enemies. They gouged out his eyes, depriving him of sight and plunging him into utter darkness. This physical blindness served as a cruel reminder of how Samson had allowed his passions and weaknesses to cloud his judgment. But the humiliations did not end there. Samson was forced into slave labor, grinding grain at the mill. His hands, once capable of great feats, were now compelled to push a heavy stone millstone. The man who had destroyed city gates, the man who had single-handedly confronted entire armies, relying only on divine strength, was now humiliated, powerless, and shackled. Samson's fall was not only physical, but also moral and spiritual. He had been chosen by God for a great purpose, to free Israel from Philistine oppression, but now he was blind, captive, and mocked by those he had once defeated. His life, filled with miraculous strength and divine destiny, had transformed into a tragedy of betrayal, intrigue, and the crushing consequences of a fatal mistake. In captivity, Samson began to reflect deeply on his life. The mighty warrior, now blind and broken, was forced to face the bitter truth of his fall. For much of his life, he had relied on his extraordinary physical strength, believing it to be the source of his power. But now, deprived of that strength and condemned to a wretched existence, Samson realized that his true strength had never been in his muscles or his hair. His strength had always come from God. He had allowed pride and impulsive actions to lead him astray. But even in his defeat, he began to grasp a profound truth. God had not abandoned him or turned away from his people. In the darkness of his imprisonment, Samson found an unexpected opportunity for spiritual rebirth. While he had previously believed his strength lay in physical capabilities, he now understood that his true power was a gift from God. And this gift depended not on the length of his hair, but on his faithfulness to God. Despite his deep fall, hope still remained. In time, as his hair began to grow back, Samson realized that this simple process of regrowth symbolized something much greater, the possibility of restoration. It was a sign that the covenant between him and God could still be renewed. Samson's hair growth was not only a physical but also a spiritual transformation. It was a sign that God's grace could still touch him, even in the deepest abyss of despair. In the depths of despair. As Samson's hair slowly grew back, like a sprout of hope, his understanding of his true mission also strengthened. He began to grasp the profound meaning of his life's purpose. His previous exploits, such as tearing a lion apart, victories over enemy armies, and destroying impregnable cities, were never solely his personal achievements. They were manifestations of divine intervention, vivid demonstrations of the Lord's power working through his chosen servant. He was chosen not for his outstanding abilities, but because God had a special plan for his destiny. In his blindness and physical weakness, Samson finally realized that the true source of his strength had always been unwavering faith in the Almighty. Now, at the lowest point of his fall, he felt ready to surrender himself entirely to God's will, as never before. The man once filled with pride and self-confidence now stood humbled, realizing that his might did not stem from his personal capabilities, but from the Lord. Samson understood that all his past victories were achieved solely through God's strength, not his own. And now, with renewed faith, he was ready to become the man God had always wanted him to be. His heart, previously driven by selfish desires, now yearned to fulfill God's divine design for his life. Samson's life journey serves as a powerful reminder that even in moments of our deepest failures, God grants us a chance for redemption. Even in times when we feel lost and forsaken, the boundless love and mercy of the Lord are always available, waiting to revive us. Samson's story, filled with tragic events, triumphs, and ultimate restoration, teaches us that no matter how low we have fallen, we can always rise again through the power and mercy of God. While Samson languished in captivity, humiliated, and chained in the city of Gaza, the Philistines rejoiced, savoring their hard-won victory. They had conquered the mighty hero of Israel, and their celebration knew no bounds. In the magnificent temple of Dagon, their pagan god, the Philistines held a grand feast, turning it into a public spectacle designed to showcase the crushing fall of their once formidable adversary. The temple was overflowing with lords, warriors, and ordinary citizens, united in joyful exultation. Their loud laughter filled the air. Their toasts and dances thundered with triumph as Samson's humiliation became the centerpiece of their victory. Chained and blinded, Samson was displayed before them as a living trophy of their conquest. Yet despite his suffering, there was something about him, an inner strength, that caused unease even among his enemies. When a young servant led him into the temple, the crowd fell silent for a moment, and respect for him briefly pierced through their mockery. Samson, though weakened and dishonored, stood amidst their celebration, and even they could not deny the power that still lurked within him. Standing between two colossal temple pillars, Samson's fingers traced the cool stone, feeling every imperfection and flaw in these massive supports. At that very moment, the realization of who he was and why he had been chosen returned to him. No longer was he tormented by feelings of revenge or malice. This was a moment when personal suffering receded into the background. It was time for the divine purpose he was meant to fulfill, for which he had been born into this world. Though his eyes were closed, his spirit was awake. He understood that this was the final page of his life's book, his chance to accomplish the mission entrusted to him by God, even at the cost of his own life. What followed was one of the most moving and profound episodes in the Bible. Samson, physically exhausted, was filled with a new sense of faith and unwavering determination. His prayer, unlike any he had uttered before, reflected a heart transformed through repentance. No longer relying on his own strength, he cried out to God, "O Lord God, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." In these words, there was no arrogant demand from a man who relied on his might, but only a humble plea from one who realized that his strength could only come from the Almighty. In this prayer, Samson acknowledged all his mistakes and his dependence on divine mercy. It was a request for one last opportunity to do God's will. As Samson grasped the pillars, his feet planted firmly on the ground, he felt an unprecedented surge of strength. It was as if his tormented and weakened body was filled with unearthly power. The energy he thought he had lost forever now flowed through his veins again, but this time it was no longer his personal strength, but divine. Gathering all his might, Samson pushed the pillars. At first they resisted, but then subtle cracks began to appear. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the mocking laughter of the Philistines turned into stunned silence as they sensed that something terrible was happening. The pillars began to crumble, and the temple, that magnificent structure, shook. Gathering all his last strength, Samson pushed with all his might. The pillars gave way, and the temple, a symbol of Philistine pride, began to collapse. The earth quaked, and the air filled with the deafening roar of destruction. The temple fell, burying beneath its rubble not only the Philistine rulers, but also thousands of soldiers and civilians who had gathered for the celebration. Samson's last act was an act of the greatest sacrifice. It was not merely revenge or a quest for glory, but the giving of his life for the greater good of the people of Israel. In his death, Samson fulfilled the very purpose for which he had been chosen, to deliver his people from the oppression of the Philistines. His sacrifice, despite all its tragedy, was the culmination of God's plan for him. In this moment, the purpose of his life was fully realized, not in triumph, but in a selfless act of obedience and faith. Samson's final words and his ultimate act of incredible strength serve as a reminder that even in periods of our deepest weaknesses, the Almighty can use us to achieve His exalted purposes. Samson's life, marked by moments of both supernatural strength and human failings, is a vivid testament to the redemptive power of divine grace. Even when we suffer defeat, the Lord can direct our final moments to accomplish something more significant than we could ever have imagined. Samson's sacrifice was not in vain. It became the key to Israel's deliverance. And as the dust settled over the ruined temple, it was impossible not to ponder the profound truth. Sometimes it is in moments of deepest loss that we find the strength to fulfill our divine destiny. Samson's sacrifice was not just an act of desperation, it was an act of redemption. Despite the numerous failures that plagued him throughout his tumultuous life, his demise ultimately brought victory to the people of Israel. By giving his life to crush the Philistines, Samson fulfilled his final mission. His death became a triumph for his people. His sacrifice became a powerful symbol of an all-encompassing divine power that transcends human capabilities and is able to transform even moments of greatest weakness into extraordinary acts aimed at achieving a divine purpose. And although the strongest man in the Bible, Samson, fell in his final act, he was reborn in spirit, and his fall became a victory for his people. After Samson's death, Israel was able to experience a brief respite from Philistine oppression. But Samson's true legacy lies not only in the battles he fought and the victories he achieved. The main thing is the lesson his life taught. Divine power far surpasses any human might, and a person's true strength lies not in their physical capabilities, but in their devotion to a divine purpose. Samson's life, filled with both great triumphs and bitter disappointments, reminds us that true strength comes not from self-confidence, but from acknowledging God's supreme authority in our lives. Through his failures and victories, Samson became a symbol of the fragile nature of human strength. His life showed that even the mightiest person can succumb to temptation, and that even in moments of apparent defeat, the will of the Lord can still be fulfilled. But his story is not only a narrative of his personal struggles, it also tells of the profound influence of those around him, especially Delilah. This woman, who ultimately betrayed him, played a key role in his downfall, and her actions serve as a reminder of how human weaknesses can be exploited for destructive purposes. Delilah, with her beauty and cunning, appears before us as one of the most controversial figures in the Bible. Although she lacked Samson's physical strength, she possessed another kind of power, the ability to manipulate his emotional vulnerability. In biblical texts, Delilah's image is etched as a symbol of treachery and cunning, and her role in Samson's tragic demise stands as one of the most monumental deceptions ever described in sacred scriptures. Her betrayal of the Israelite hero traditionally evokes a sense of deep contempt. However, upon closer examination, Delilah's personality proves to be far more complex and ambiguous. Unlike the overt enemies Samson had faced previously, Delilah showed no aggression. On the contrary, she managed to win his trust, presenting herself as a devoted and loving woman eager to please her chosen one. It was this deception that made her betrayal especially painful and destructive, for she skillfully manipulated Samson's feelings, making him believe in her sincerity and devotion. The motives for Delilah's actions remain a subject of debate and speculation. Although the Bible does not provide a definitive answer, it is clear that strong external pressure influenced her decisions. Perhaps she was tempted by promises of immense wealth and high social standing. It is not excluded that she was driven by fear of brutal reprisal, which could have befallen her if she refused to cooperate with the Philistines who surrounded her. Whatever the true reasons, Delilah's manipulative nature is beyond doubt. She was completely unconcerned about the destructive consequences her actions would have for Samson and the entire Israelite nation. She coldly used his love and affection as a tool to achieve her own selfish goals, ultimately discovering the secret that led to his tragic death. Nevertheless, Delilah's story is not just a tale of betrayal. It is also a story of temptation, of those subtle and insidious forces that can lead a person astray, not by brute force or direct coercion, but through skillful emotional manipulation. Delilah did not appear before Samson as an overt enemy. On the contrary, she managed to gain his trust, becoming a close friend and confidant for him, someone to whom, he believed, he could open his heart without fear. It was this subtle game and manipulation that became the key to her success. Delilah perfectly understood that Samson trusted her completely, and she unhesitatingly used that trust to lead him to inevitable ruin. However, ultimately, this manipulation turned against her, leading to her personal downfall. Perhaps for a time she managed to stay in a winning position, but in the end, she lost everything that truly mattered in life: honesty, dignity, and the trust of those who once believed in her. Delilah's further fate after Samson's death remains shrouded in mystery. The Bible contains no mention of her life after these tragic events. Nevertheless, her role in Samson's story cannot be overestimated. She became an eternal symbol of how complex, contradictory, and ambiguous human motives can be. Her betrayal, despite its monumental scale, was not merely an act of malice and cunning, but rather a reflection of her own weaknesses, fears, and desires. In this sense, Delilah's story echoes Samson's own. Both were driven by their personal weaknesses and passions, yet both played important roles in the realization of a larger divine plan. The story of Samson and Delilah ultimately teaches us about responsibility for our choices and the tragic consequences they can lead to. Samson's decision to reveal the secret of his incredible strength led not only to his personal demise, but also to untold suffering for his entire people. The story of Samson and Delilah, like a mirror, reflects the eternal questions of human existence. The choices we make determine not only our destiny, but also the destinies of those around us. Just as Samson, endowed with extraordinary strength, succumbed to temptation and betrayed his people, so too do we daily stand before a choice between duty and personal desires. Similarly, Delilah's decision to betray Samson for her own gain led her to lose everything of true value. These stories remind us that even the most outstanding heroes and seemingly innocent people are susceptible to temptation and deceit. The ability to choose whether to submit to the will of the Almighty or to be guided by selfish motives shapes our lives and our legacy. The story of Samson and Delilah poses a question to each of us: what is our true strength? Is it in our personal abilities, selfish desires, or in trusting a divine plan, even when it leads us down thorny paths? Samson's life is a path of redemption, reminding us that no matter how low we fall, the Almighty can use us for a great purpose if we maintain faith and trust in Him, even in the most difficult moments. Samson's life, filled with triumphs and tragedies, offers us profound lessons about choice, its consequences, and the incredible impact it has not only on our lives, but on the lives of others. His story is not merely a narrative of physical might or military victories. It is a tale of redemption, sacrifice, and the fulfillment of a divine calling. Despite numerous mistakes and weaknesses, Samson was chosen by the Almighty to deliver the people of Israel from Philistine oppression. The tragedy of his life only underscores the greatness of his mission. And it is through his final sacrifice that we see the depth of the Almighty's plan. Samson's greatest feat was not in the many battles he fought, nor in the physical exploits that made him a legend. His greatest moment of strength came at the very end, in an act of self-sacrifice. When Samson decided to give his life by collapsing the temple of Dagon, he achieved ultimate victory not only for himself, but for his people. It was not the strength of his muscles or his hair that made him strong at that moment, but his submission to the will of the Almighty. Samson's death became his complete submission to the divine purpose for which he had been chosen, and in this tragic finale, he forever fulfilled his role as the deliverer of Israel. The path to this moment was marked by immense personal growth and painful reflection. After his fall, blinded and deprived of freedom, Samson realized that the strength he had once relied upon was not his own. In his darkest hour, he understood that true strength comes from faithfulness to the Almighty, not from physical capabilities. His prayer in the Temple of Dagon reflected this transformation. Samson's prayer was not a desperate cry for personal glory or victory, but a plea for strength to fulfill his God-given purpose. He asked God to strengthen him one last time, not for revenge, but to complete the mission that had always been the true meaning of his life. This is no longer just a narrative about a man endowed with extraordinary physical might, but a profound parable about understanding true strength, which lies in obedience to the will of the Almighty. In this moment of humility, Samson's power returned to him not by his own will, but as a gift of divine grace. Grasping the temple pillars, he felt an unearthly power fill him, and as he exerted all his strength, the temple trembled, and the pillars began to crack under the burden of his unwavering faith. This moment was imbued with divine energy. The ground beneath the Philistines' feet trembled as Samson, with a final effort, brought down the temple. The very structure that once symbolized the triumph and pride of the enemies became the instrument of their demise. It was not Samson's physical strength that overcame the Philistines, but the almighty power of God, manifested through his submission and sacrifice. This final act of faith not only destroyed the temple of the pagan god Dagon, but also crushed the Philistine rule, freeing the people of Israel from years of oppression. Samson's death was an act of the greatest sacrifice, but it was not in vain. Although it occurred at a moment of his personal weakness and suffering, it served as a powerful reminder of the possibility of redemption. This story teaches us that no matter how low we fall and however deep our mistakes, the Lord can always use us to achieve His high purpose. Samson's ultimate victory came through his weakness, reminding us that even in the most hopeless situations, God is capable of transforming our brokenness into something outstanding. Delilah's betrayal, Samson's weakness, and his final sacrifice all serve as a warning that our choices matter greatly, especially when we are chosen by God. Samson's life compels us to reflect on where we seek our strength. Do we rely on our own abilities, as Samson did, or do we depend on God's help in overcoming difficulties? Samson's story shows us that the true source of strength lies not in physical might, but in our willingness to submit to the divine plan. Ultimately, Samson's story is a tale of redemption. Even in his most difficult and vulnerable moments, God used him to fulfill His will. His legacy is defined not by his mistakes, but by the victory God achieved through his sacrifice. And as we reflect on Samson's life journey, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we draw from this story? How can we relinquish reliance on our own strength and trust in God's great purpose intended for our lives? If this video helped you understand a little more deeply the mystery of Samson's strength and weakness, then the goal is achieved. Thank you for watching to the end and for being with us in this reflection. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is important to us. Subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Remember, true strength is not in human hands, but in a heart filled with God.